Hello and welcome to Beyond Games, the YouTube channel all about what's next for gaming. I'm John Jordan, and joining me today is Christopher Holgaard from MODL.AI. How's it going, Christopher?
Hi there. Hi, John. Thanks so much for having me. I am doing well, thanks.
Good, good. So we're going to dive straight in, and you're going to tell us what MODL.AI is.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So MODL.AI, we are a startup out of Copenhagen, Denmark, but actually global. And essentially, what we're about is we are using very new, novel methods from artificial intelligence and machine learning and applying it to game development pipelines. So in essence, we're a company that's all about making game development easier, using various kinds of automation and artificial intelligence.
Cool, good. That was good. That was in a nutshell. Now let's
Yeah.
unpick the nutshell. Mix our metaphors. Let's take the onion skins off and get to the bottom. So you're talking about pipelines. So I guess that's something that in the game development space people talk about pipelines all the time. But I guess outside of that we may not be exactly sure. We may conjure up an idea of a pipe with some water going through or something like that. So what does this actually mean, and what actually sort of is the problem that you're solving for developers?
Yeah, for sure. So when you think about sort of like the game development process, it's you can sort of like think of it as existing in different phases. You start out with ideation, you come up with a great game idea, then you maybe do some documents describing it, maybe you do some drawings, various kinds of material. Then you start going into sort of like different stages of prototyping. You start putting the game together. Eventually, you start sort of like understanding what the game is going to be, what it wants to be, what you want it to be, and then you start building it and producing it. And then eventually going through that process, and depending on the size of the game, this could be, if it's a game jam, it's a weekend. If it's a AAA game, it's many years. But all these like different stages all have sort of like different points where a lot of the different groups and capabilities and disciplines that work on games where they interact and have various sort of like tasks. And especially when you're ramping up to production, there's a lot of work in there that's repetitive and manual, where you have to sort of like do the same thing over and over again. And then even when your game launches and when it goes to market, most games these days may transition into sort of like a model where you keep the game alive. You're not done when you've just gone gold master and shipped it. It doesn't go on a store shelf anymore, and then you're done, right? Most games, they have communities, they have DLCs, they have updates. So you're really just running your game and keeping it alive for years after the launch date. And at that time, you also have to do sort of like a lot of maintenance and a lot of further like content production. And for all of these stages, like that's what I think about as the pipeline, from the first idea and then all the way to maintaining the game and having it in the market, basically.
Okay, so let's take off another onion skin. So what aspect of that are you helping out in? Because I guess AI is a very broad term, but normally AI works well when it's sort of quite specialist, I suppose. So what's the kind of AI aspect of it that is helping developers do this kind of stuff quicker or faster?
Yeah, sure. So we focus on three different parts of this, and so the first part that we look at in MODL.AI is testing. So testing the game content, and that can mean basic questions like, does it work at all? And then it can get a little more complicated and be like,
always good to know, isn't it?
yeah. Well, you'd be surprised like how many things can hide in your game build. And then the next question is, does it work the way I want it to, basically? And those are the two things we focus on in testing. Then we also help people with making sense of player behavior and understanding what players are doing. And the third thing that we help people do is basically generate content, so automate parts of the content creation, in particular the parts that are sort of like repetitive and sort of like where you're mostly sort of like doing the grind rather than doing the creative work. So those are like the three things that we insert ourselves into. And the sort of like common denominator for that, I guess, is that those are all places where you have aspects of human behavior, where you have things that normally you would have a human developer, designer, or a player do something. Well, in those places we use basically AI to copy some of that human behavior and automate some of the processes. So it's sort of like robot automation inside game development. That's maybe a way to think about it.
Okay, so that seems pretty powerful. That you're sort of I don't know whether training AI is the right term, because that can be quite technical. But you're basically getting these AIs. You're kind of sometimes teaching them what to do, and obviously that speeds things up. But equally, I guess with generally with AI, that you have to be quite kind of skilled in knowing how to sort of program AI or kind of set up, kind of use existing rules and stuff like that. So I guess that's been another sort of issue. In general AI, and certainly in the game space, that you need these kind of very kind of well-trained kind of people in order to actually get AI to work in a very good way. And I guess this is different AI to kind of getting an NFT to be realistic in a game. That's again another sort of use of AI, but this is different. This is sort of outside the game, around the process of the game. So how do you actually make it easy for developers, or how much technical knowledge does a developer need to start interacting with what you're offering?
Well, less and less. So we've sort of like been building out our tools, and we're getting to a place where, and ideally none at all, right? But we strongly believe that one of the ways that you make some of these like AI methods more available to people is to build really good tools around them and do really good UX. So one of the first things that we've been putting together is one of these like automated testing systems, and it's basically sort of like imagine sort of like a player or robot that will try to break everything that it's allowed to touch in your game. So now when you set that up in your game using our tools, we actually have a GUI where you tell it like what are all the actions that the player is allowed to use. And then you also set up what parts of the game are important, but all of that can be done through a menu interface. And then the AI happens, sort of like it ties those two things together, and will make the robot basically just try everything that's available to the player in your game in order to break it. And in that instance, you don't really need to know anything specialized around how does the AI work, how do the different AI methods work. You just need how to sort of like define. You need to know how to define the input and the output. And I think that's sort of like the vision where we should take these like methods to make them available to as many game developers as possible. But because essentially you don't want to have people to need to sort of like learn a complete different skill set in order to get some of these benefits, right?
So, in terms of kind of, you say break the game, so do anything in the game. So immediately what comes to mind is sort of a kind of navigation. So basically, kind of walking around the world and trying to kind of fall out the mesh or something like that. But I guess it's a lot more than that. It could be. What sort of examples could you give of things that would be considered in that context breaking the game that the AI might try and do?
Yeah. That's just a starting point. But actually, I back when I studied for my master's degree in games in university quite a few years ago by now. One of my good friends, the person I wrote my master's thesis with, his study job was exactly that he would try to break the geometry 8 hours a day in his work as a QA tester. That's what he did on the side when he wasn't writing his thesis. So there actually is quite a bit of need for even these like simple things. But other things that you can talk about in terms of like breaking the game is just often checking that all the assets are there, checking that things are loading when you expect them to load, that everything is showing up in the game when you need it to, that it doesn't crash. You can also have this like, many questions like, okay, what happens if somebody just leaves the game on and plays it for, 24 hours in a row? Do we have memory leaks? Do we have different things that will make the game crash? So all of these like questions. And then the final thing that we allow game developers to do is to extend what the AI is looking for with their own logic, basically. So they can define their own failure cases or things that they just don't want to see in the game build. And then, if the AI ends up doing that, they get notified. So you can sort of like, because at the end of the day, the people who really know what a catastrophic error looks like for any particular game, outside of it like crashing or running out of memory and all that stuff, are the game designers themselves, right? So they can sort of like predict and spot what they'd be worried about in the game build as well.
Mm-hmm. And so would the kind of the tools be kind of set up in a way that a game designer who, some of them may be very technical, some of them may be, not very technical, that they could be able to handle that themselves, or would they sort of need to work with a programmer, particularly if they wanted to make some of these bespoke sort of kind of failure cases?
Yeah. For that, you'd still need to work with the programmer, but we're setting it up so that your own, gameplay programmer would be able to do it. You wouldn't need an AI expert. It's really just a way of defining, if this happened in the game, let me know, and I'll use that to understand what went wrong or how I should change the code.
Cool. So, being the CEO of a startup, I'm sure lots very exciting, but not sometimes bad exciting some of the time. So obviously, kind of being a startup in a startup space, you kind of come up with a great idea, and then you kind of gets kicked around. You sort of come up with something that kind of you think works, and you kind of start to productize it. But then there's this kind of interesting point at which you kind of think you've got not just you, but anyone in the kind of this kind of space that, kind of thinks they've got something that will be useful, and then they try and give it out to developers, and then that's often an interesting point at which you kind of find maybe you have to kind of change the tools a little bit, or maybe you have to kind of educate the developers a little bit, or probably a bit of everything. So where are you at that stage? Do you have developers using the tools yet? What kind of feedback are you getting? Are you sort of having to iterate around kind of what the feedback you're getting is?
Yeah. We're exactly going through that right now, or we're continuously going through that, right? I think the most important information you can get are from like the end users. So we come with a good idea, but we also, in a certain sense, we're like pitching to game studios. You should, to a certain extent, change how you do your game development. So we want to transform how people are doing this work, right? And when you bring this notion out into studios, and it just turns out that maybe 40% of what you thought was important is maybe less important to the developers. So you go back, you iterate, and you change. So that's something that we're going through at the moment, and it's extremely valuable to have the game studios give you that feedback.
And I guess if I was a game developer and someone comes in and says, sort of, I guess you could have different emphasis on it, but basically, you need to change your game development. I guess some developers are, maybe quite excited about doing something new. I imagine, just in general human psychology terms, most of us, when we're told we've been doing something, or we've not been doing something as well as we could have done, or maybe a bit sort of like, who are you to tell me what I've been doing, sort of thing. So how do you sort of kind of make that argument kind of real to them that there's the advantages that they're going to be getting using these kind of tools? Because I guess obviously you're very focused on your tools, but I guess in general, sort of these sort of AI driven kind of technologies are generally coming into most software development in different forms. So it's something that all developers will sort of have to deal with.
Yeah, for sure. I think so. I mean, one of the first things that we always stress. So the people who started the company and the three of us who run it on a daily basis, we've been developing our own games for many years. So in many ways, we're sort of like scratching an itch that we know exists, or like we're addressing problems that we've seen ourselves. So we often just base the conversation in that. And then I think it's much less about telling people that we're doing something wrong, and much more about saying, what would you do if your QA team had more time on their hands, if your creative team had more time on your hands? Would that be, would that be interesting to you if we could set free some of that waiting and some of that rote manual labor, and you can spend it on other things? And that's very much the way that we phrase the pitch. We know that it's sort of like a tall order to ask people to invest in a new way of working, in a new kind of like technology. But then if we can show people, down the line, you're actually going to win this back, and you're going to sort of like see a dividend on that investment that you put into it. That's the main way that we phrase it. Because obviously, the way that people work at the moment does work, because games are shipped and they come out, and often they don't have that many bugs in them and issues and things like that. But for us, it's all about making the case that this can make people's lives better, basically.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of stage are you at? Do you have developers using this for games that are in development, or are you still in a bit more of that kind of an early stage that people are sort of testing it out?
Yep. So we have, it sort of like depends on what part of the pipeline we're talking about. But for our two products, we have something that focuses on content generation, and that's out in production and rolling out with a few studios. And then we have another product called the Glitch Finder, which is all about the testing, and that is rolling out into production now as well. And we're bringing a few more studios on over summer.
So let's talk a bit about the content kind of creation side then. So obviously, we've talked about the kind of QA and finding bugs, and I guess that's sort of, I can kind of see game developers, not finding that particularly, finding that a problem, and anything that can help them solve their bugs sort of quicker without these kind of massive QA teams, probably fairly valuable. Equally, I can imagine content being something that's seen as a little bit sort of kind of more key to the kind of what the game is and what a game developer does. So a little bit more kind of sacred, maybe in the game developer's mind. So can you talk before we get into that? Can you talk a little bit about how the content kind of stuff works?
Oh yeah, sure. So the kind of content generation that we do is essentially we have systems that will take level design patterns from human designers and learn to recognize those, sort of like understand the patterns at different levels in them, and then replicate and generate new ones from those examples. And so you train it on examples that were originally made by the human designer. And then the system can generate, many more variations based on that. But crucially, it's sort of like it learns to replicate the style of the human designer, and then it still allows the human designer to put in all sorts of like constraints and requirements around the generation process. So it's very much an interactive, sort of like almost co-creative thing. Mm-hmm. It's not a question of wholesale replacing the designer. It's like a power up or a boost for the designer, right? Okay. Then the other side of the system is that once you've generated these levels, so let's say you generate 250 or whatever for your puzzle game, you run the bots through them and you get statistics around them, not just that they work, but also in terms of, how do they, how difficult are they, how many moves would I need, things like that. So you get sort of like a controllable loop of generation and testing. And then from that, we still put the human designer at the center of this process, because what they will do is that they'll take a look at what's generated and they'll choose the ones that they want to keep working on, and they do the polish and the final part of the craft on their own. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know whether it's just my brain, but when you say levels, I kind of think kind of first person shooter levels, kind of racing levels, I suppose, something like that. Is that sort of the I mean,
Sure.
does it matter what sort of levels it is? I guess obviously there's the a lot of precision around sort of those PvP things, because they need want balance and you want certain variation and that sort of thing. Would the AI system be good at doing those sort of things, or excuse me, or what kind of genres do you think this would particularly work well on?
Oh, sure. Yeah, we've rolled this into production with casual game studios, so for puzzles actually. And in many ways, puzzles are quite intricate and require a lot of precision as well, because every different single element matters, right? But essentially, we're looking actually with sort of talking to a few companies as well about expanding this to sort of like games with larger spaces. But essentially, the kind of levels that we generate, it's all about item placement. So it's like, what goes here, what goes here, what part of the region do I put this in, where do I put this? So it's all about the structural parts. It's not like you'll see other things like Speed Tree and Houdini and all these different things, but are all about generating the final assets. But the kind of content generation we do, it's about getting sort of like the functional part right, and getting all the elements placed in a good way. But we never presumed that our system will generate something that's 100% ready to go at the moment. We always expect like a human to find, validate the final example and say, this is what I want, or, I'm going to take this is like 80% complete, and then I'm going to do the last 20%. But then you save sort of like the initial part of like setting it up and doing the first part of the work.
Could you do something like when you say puzzles? I'm thinking sort of match 3 mobile games, which go last forever and always are running out of content. I mean, would that be a good kind of example? Have you tried it with those?
Yeah. That's been part of the space where we've been working in, where we have systems in production, and they have exactly sort of like this challenge, because I don't know, Candy Crush probably has, I would say, 9,000 levels at this point, right? And there's players will burn through the levels really quickly, so you need to have that content coming out all the time. And one of the challenges, first of all, like match 3 levels are actually quite intricate and sort of like difficult to make, because you really need to consider sort of like all the aspects. And then once you've made one, you really need to play through it in order to understand sort of like the functional characteristics. So you can't just look at it and understand if you've made a good level. You need to play it maybe 10 to 10, 15 times in order to get the sort of like the play statistics out of the puzzle, right? And that's again a place where this kind of like automation can save you doing that. So you can play it once, you have the bot play it 15 times, and then you kind of like have the information you need in order to know, is this good or bad.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. So there was one more thing I wanted to cover, and we kind of tread carefully when we enter the metaverse, because no one knows what it means. Maybe you do, I don't know. But you think there's some you don't know. Okay, all right. We'll leave the definition of the metaverse.
I'll give it a shot. Yeah.
Got it. But how do you think the kind of systems that you're sort of building? I guess probably not exactly now, but in future years, how do you think that will kind of play into this idea that sort of games are becoming sort of these much bigger kind of open ecosystem spaces, whatever platforms, whatever you want to call them? Yeah, how does it, stuff like MODL.AI kind of fit into that sort of world for developers?
Yeah. I mean, we are at MODLAI. We're really excited about where all of that is going. Essentially, no matter where sort of like where it ends up and what the metaverse ends up being. But from our perspective, from the AI perspective, if we say metaverses are somehow these large universes with many people in it who are building things and interacting in it. Essentially, that is that's essentially our perfect final application case for this kind of technology, because when you think about it, you have a lot of content that needs to be both built and understood and tested. You have a lot of people interacting here with various complex kinds of behaviors that we can then observe, and we can see what people are doing inside these metaverses. We can use that as a training set for the AIs in order to learn how we should shape their behavior. And also these people are generating different things, and that's maybe also a place where the AI would be able to assist them. And across like all of these sort of like different parts of what a metaverse really consists of, at the core of it, or the red thread there, is that they are spaces, they're spaces for human behavior, for people to enact different kinds of behavior. But we just have sort of like we have the ability to actually observe the context for it. We can see what people are doing within that space. We can then, we can absorb that, we can leverage that information in order to train AIs to basically both help with the construction of it, to make sense what's going on in it, and all that also means recognizing different kinds of players, offering them different kinds of experiences based on how they're acting in the metaverse or the metaverses, and then also responding to that in terms of what kind of content we're building and offering to them basically. I also think there's a large potential for having AIs as sort of as being part of metaverses, as characters that you interact with in the same way that you would interact with players. And again, I think this kind of technology is suited very, very well exactly for these kinds of use cases.
No, you're talking now. I'm definitely thinking that almost kind of maybe this is kind of the sci-fi brain coming through, but the AI is kind of operating sort of live, almost as sort of a virtual game developer in the metaverse. It seems very metaverse, isn't it, to have sort of AIs sort of building the game as you sort of go along.
No, but I think
a nightmare or.
I think there's maybe initially just a smaller version of that, but I think you're exactly right. That's the kind of thing that we're going to see, right? And maybe you'll even let the players sort of like with these metaverses, the line between the player and the creator also becomes very blurred. So maybe you end up making this available to the players as well, and they get to train some of the AI systems, or maybe they train some of the AI behavior, or you can author an AI, inside of your part of the metaverse, and then you send it to someone else, and they get to experience it, right? And it could be one that plays the game, or it could be one that builds something in the game with you. I think all of those things are realistic, and as these platforms sort of like really start coming together, it'll start becoming more evident how this like really fits into that experience.
Mm-hmm. I guess it's kind of interesting. It's taking the idea of sort of people, not always in a good way, running bots within sort of game economies like kind of World of Warcraft to kind of farm this sort of stuff, and then the next level is you just have you say you have bots sort of running in the game. That's part of what the players kind of what the player has as kind of features available to them, and some of them may be obviously good, some you may use them in good ways or bad ways or whatever, but at least then you're bringing them all sort of within the game, and then within them, or in Metaverse, whatever it is, and so there's nothing sort of on the outside being illegal, because everything's allowed inside if it's set up in the right way, I suppose. But maybe a discussion for another time before we get too carried away.
But I think you're right. I think it's about catching and sort of like funneling and shaping that, rather than people will want to interact creatively, with and using AI with these kinds of games. And I think what we are seeing is with the metaverses will start supporting that as like more of a natural feature, rather than something that you're trying to keep outside and sort of like manage that way.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Christopher. That was brilliant. We've covered quite a lot of ground there, but I think it kind of really shows the sort of power of AI systems in both kind of, I guess, more functional terms for developers, but also, I guess, in the future, more as sort of open, kind of fun things for us to play around with in games. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Now, thank you very much for watching. This is Beyond Games, the YouTube channel, all about what's happening next for gaming. Gaming's going through a massive explosion, lots of different technologies coming in, and we are here to see what is going to be happening, trying to make some predictions. But thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and see you again soon.